We're really, really lucky to have Colin come in. Colin is the head of art and design now.
Fashion and textiles.
Is it still fashion and textiles?
Fashion and textiles.
Okay, it's the School of Fashion and Textiles at Birmingham, City University, Birmingham.
Birmingham City University.
I know, I get it wrong, but what can I say? I'm so sorry, he's not going to give me a job, is he? I've known Colin since 1995, he reminded me today. He is an expert in fashion and textiles primarily, but he's a fine artist and does many, many other things. And he's travelled with his work and his studies. He's travelled all over the world. What was your first PhD in? Not that you've done another one, but
my PhD was in modelling creativity. It was to do with computer modelling of art and design.
Okay, so what I'm trying to sort of point out is that when we become artists and designers, we start off with one thing and we go along a big, big journey to get to somewhere else, and we do lots of different things and pick lots of things up on the way. The movie that I'm going to show you has a tenuous link to Colin, and it's called The First Monday in May, and it's Vogue's organisation of the Met Gala ball, and this time it was featuring Rihanna, and it was about China, so I thought it might be tenuous, but it's there. So please do welcome Colin Gale, Professor Colin Gale.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I was asked to talk to you about something to do with globalisation, and I've had a lot of international experience. The first thing I'd say about it was that it wasn't anything that I planned. It was something simply that I fell into. And I think it's quite difficult in your life to imagine that you might suddenly find yourself travelling around the world. But interestingly, I think the only reason I ended up doing it was because of people's perception of what my nature is, and because I'm friendly, and because my friends helped to take me around the world, and then other people found me useful. So there's a kind of incremental set of experiences I'm going to talk about. And the particular part of the world that I'm talking about, where I suppose it relates a lot to work and my own work, is to do with South Asia and Southeast Asia and China in particular. So the story begins in Taiwan and Malaysia, and also involves India and Thailand, and then a little bit more later about that. So the region of the world that I'm talking about, where I spent sort of 20 years of my time, about a quarter of every year, travelling, starts over here, slightly off here in Ahmedabad in India, down to Chennai and Delhi, sort of up in the north of China, all across this region of China, and then Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore down here. So you've got an idea of the scope of that. Why was I sent? What did I experience? What did I do? I think the first reason that I was sent was to be a kind of diplomat, to undertake negotiations between institutions, kind of open doors and create opportunities. That somebody saw in me the fact that I could have meetings with strangers and kind of find mutual terms on which to conduct work. The second experience was students. I think it's very easy to think that there's a big distance between academic staff and students, but actually much of my experiences in life have come through working with students, and then the students offering me opportunities when they too go on to have their careers and employments in the future. Other parts of it are to do with my own creative practice, which has run alongside my kind of professional employment over the years and involved the fact that I could do things. There were things that I could offer when I went to these places. The fact that I'd studied to an advanced level also meant that I could help other people study to an advanced level. One of the big drivers why my particular employer kept sending me there was to do with recruitment, because universities nowadays are businesses. They typically have anything from 14% to 40% of their students recruited internationally, and each one of those students brings a great deal of money into the university. Another thing is to do with conferences and talks. One of the skills that I've managed to develop is that I can quickly put together a PowerPoint and I can turn up in any situation. Somebody can throw something at me and I can suddenly talk to a whole bunch of people. So the kind of transferable skills that you acquire in life, which may not be subject specific, suddenly become useful in different contexts. Other parts of it are to do with writing and publishing. I've been an author and I ended up developing a publishing company. And the last part of it is about being a manager, which I am now in my institution, where I have to think about the international experience both for staff and for students and for the benefit of my employer. So the story begins in Taiwan. My boss at the time, from the age of 25 to 40, I didn't travel outside of the UK. I had no imagination that I was going to go anywhere. My boss at that time, was probably the same age as I am now, they'd had some kind of communication with a university in Taipei in Taiwan called Furen University, and they screwed it up basically, and they were scared because they were dealing with a German missionary nun who was the boss there. It was very tough. I think they must have looked at me and thought, oh, he's sweet. Nobody's going to be nasty to him. Let's send Colin. So I went to Taiwan at that time to establish an exchange program with students from Taiwan. And this was our first group of international students back in about 95 at that time. The experience was quite an exotic one, to suddenly be transported to the other side of the world. Perhaps nowadays we don't think of it so much because travel is so easy, it's so cheap, you can go here, there, everywhere. In those days it was a little bit more daunting to suddenly be dropped to the other side of the world and to see strange spectacles. And I think when you start to undertake work internationally, there's a bit of you which is a tourist. You look at everything as a kind of touristic spectacle, and it's some time before you actually start to feel at home or integrated or understand. But anyway, it went well. This was a bunch of first students from there, and their careers in turn developed. He became a lecturer, and then he became a famous fashion designer, then he became a big TV celebrity there, and there's some of his work on the top. And I visited students again. This guy went on to be head of fashion at Bournemouth, and then he was head of fashion at Salford. And this was a PhD student from Taiwan who I'll talk about in a little bit. So what happens is you kind of go to a country, you start to develop relationships. People from that country come here, you go there again, and bit by bit you create a network. And that network is very important, starts to have an impact on your own life and experience. So I'm going to kind of run through a similar format for a range of countries, which is kind of why did I go there, what was my experience of that country, what was my own personal reaction to that, and a few other things. Taiwan is a country that was a Japanese colony from the sort of end of the 19th century really, so it has elements of Japanese culture in it, but it also was the place where when China had a conflict, a portion of the kind of non-communist part of China fled to this country. When I went there, it was just about at its industrial peak. It had gone from being kind of colonial backwater to becoming one of the world's major economies in the space of 13 years or 15 years. If you can imagine that degree of transformation, and I think one of the experiences I've had of Asia is just the incredible pace of development. In a country like this, it took 200, 300 years to go from a kind of industrial revolution to the kind of post-industrial consumer society we have now. Many of these Asian countries do it in the space of decades, which creates all kinds of tensions and kind of dissonance in the existence of the old and the presence of the new. But in terms of Asia generally, Taiwan was quite developed. And the things about it I remember, my first visit, I went in the middle of the summer, terrific humidity. going out for a meeting and the rain being so heavy that I was wading in water up to my knees to go to a meeting that then goes into kind of, you know, flood things. And my first experience of Chinese culture in Asia. I'd been a painter by that time for quite a long time, so you kind of reflect on your experiences. You can manifest your experiences in different ways in your life. Some people write, I also write poems. This was to do with going to the seaside and suddenly seeing like 50 to 100 oil tankers. I'd never seen so many huge ships on the sea before. This was beetle huts where they sell beetle nuts because people chew these nuts and used to spit them out by the side of the road. On the campus they had a tatty old pond with turtles in it. So you start to kind of, like I say, have this sort of tourist response to somewhere. You try and absorb the differences and the realities of it. You may remember the student at the end, Ching-Yu, who became a doctor in the end. And this is quite some time later, this is like 10, 15 years later. And her project was about looking back at Chinese tradition and culture. There was a kind of dress called the Shui Tianyi, which had disappeared in sort of used to be worn commonly 100 years ago, and there's no records of it, hardly at all, left in China, and yet it was universally worn. And there's a theme that came out of her kind of work, which is about look back at your culture, do things to do with patchwork, which was that style, and then try and modernise it or bring it back into the mainstream. And those kinds of themes of tradition, using design to modernise or adapt or to create branding, ran through a number of different projects that I supervised over the years, and I became a specialist in kind of Asian cultures and Asian arts. A few years after going to Taiwan, I was running MA courses, and the MA courses started to attract international students. And there was one textile student, and I started chatting to her, and she said, oh, my husband's here as well, he's a painter. I said, oh, that's interesting, I'm a painter too. And before I know it, her husband has said, come and exhibit your work. And suddenly I have the prospect of trying to get 20 to 30 paintings across to Malaysia. So these were some of the ones that went over there. And that was about 2001, I think, or something. And this was the student, as Lisa, and this was her husband, Susli, who's a kind of abstract expressionist in the American style. And I had some quite unusual, I spent 10 days with Malaysian artists. And we tend to think, and certainly at the time, I'd read a lot about culture being global, you know, that there were global rock stars, there were globally famous painters. This was the time of sort of Damien Hirst and Brit art hitting the British painting scene. Painting was unfashionable, but painting was still hugely fashionable in Malaysia. So I ended up in the jungle, and then again, sort of 10 years later, I go back and meet Lisa, and she's doing a project which is about trying to recapture disappearing culture in Malaysia. The way that people used to dress, the fabrics that they wore, were disappearing. In the West, we're very used to the idea of museums. Museums have existed for 100 years, they're well funded, they're kind of founded on the basis of collections of the rich. But in many of these countries, their heritage has not been kept, it's not been developed. They haven't had the public money to develop museum systems. So people like us, Lisa, are doing key jobs in those societies, trying to find things. In those early years, the sort of beginning of the millennium really, I think the feelings that I was having, because I was starting to go to a range of countries in Southeast Asia, was a kind of response to decoration. There's something about the sort of Northern European culture which is grey, dull, a bit boring palette, and suddenly you're thrown into a world which is full of shiny, sparkly, pretty, bright colours. And you kind of think that didn't fit with the sort of artistic aesthetics that I'd been brought up with. Apart from paintings, I've always done computer art as well, computer prints, and so those are a response to that. But I think the main thing that I had going there was suddenly finding a group of artists who were passionate about painting, who were committed, who weren't cynical, like say the art scene is a little bit in the UK. We've become very cool about our idea of arts and culture, but here people had a kind of pure commitment to what they were doing, and their idea of colour was revolutionary to me. It was, they really didn't care. They'd use the brightest colours out of the tube in an uninhibited way, and that affected the way I painted. Around this time as well, my international experiences started to inform some other projects I was doing. I wrote a book which was for textile students, which covered a whole range of topics, and that company said to me, you know, we sell a lot in America. When you write this, can you make sure that you address the American student? So I thought, fine. Actually, I'll address every student from everywhere. Let's do this democratically. Let's have China. Let's have Russia. Let's have India. Let's make sure that every student has something that they can see, that they lock into a bigger world and a bigger topic. In 2003, I undertook my first trip to India, and again it was to do with this kind of like, who can we send? Who might be able to do this? Who can sit down in a room and have a kind of manage some complicated discussions but get on with people as well? And so they sent me to an organisation called NIFT, which is an enormous fashion and textile university with multiple campuses, each of which is the site of a university in India. And I had to explain to the boss of that institution why on earth she should write or sign a deal between our university and their university. She said, well, I don't have to do that. We can just do whatever we want to do. So I had to explain about how sophisticated universities end up with these kind of formal arrangements between them. And thereafter, I've only been to India twice, and the reason I've been averse to India is my stomach can't deal with it. I became seriously ill each time I went, so I kind of let other people deal with that now. But now my institution has a range of collaborations with different Indian fashion and textile universities, either franchising our courses or research collaborations. If you think about what I said about Taiwan, Taiwan was this kind of very modern Chinese society. India is now sort of the most dynamic economy in the world. But like much of Asia, it's got this enormous tension between an almost agrarian society and a kind of super advanced society. This is a bridge here in Mumbai. It's a phenomenal piece of engineering. It's as modern as you could get. And yet also in Mumbai, you'll see the most upsetting of slums, as you will find in various places in India. And it had a kind of there's a kind of hypnotic quality to India. It's quite strange. But of all the places that I'd been, and by the time I'd been to India, I'd travelled quite a bit around Southeast Asia. This place, by the time I got to one city, Bangalore, I'd seen enough. I actually broke down in tears. So you can have emotional shock from visiting these places. It isn't just a case of going there as a tourist. What you see, what you experience where you go, because you're not always going to these kind of, you know, sanctums of tourism, can personally affect you deeply. So the painting that came out of that was to do with seeing 50 people destitute on rubble around a fire somewhere in the northeast of the country. This idea of working with students, or students inviting me to do things and then me responding, happened again around 2005. I had a PhD student, again working with traditional culture, trying to modernise it and develop it. And she was a lecturer, and she said, oh, so you've done an exhibition in Malaysia, come and do an exhibition in Bangkok. So this time I sent 40 paintings. And you deal with the logistics of, I think one of the things that you have to think about when you think about the world is, how can I do something? How can I go somewhere? Don't say no, always say yes, and then find a solution. And the solution for me was kind of like, if I send them watercolours, right? I can pack big watercolours, it's cheap to post, they can frame them there, it happens, it gets done. So the experience here, this is Namphon, who was a PhD student, that's not so very long ago, and another MA student, and I've known them now for 20 years, and we work and collaborate together. There's the exhibition. I think, again, each country has its own characteristics. Many of you may have been to Thailand. Bangkok is the most visited city in the world. My first experience was kind of looking on Google Maps or something, thinking, oh, there's a shopping mall not far away, I'll go and walk there. It can only be half a mile. And within 5 minutes, I was dripping in sweat. It was just so hot. So you kind of learn that in different countries, there's different ways you get about, and there's different ways that you respond to them. And bit by bit, you develop traveller's skills to do things. Thailand, again, is intensely decorative culture, one of the world's great cuisines, and alongside this world of work, there's obviously that kind of tourist dimension to it. Namphon's work was working with craft workers in villages, ordinary people actually, who had a tradition of producing weaves, which are part of their national and cultural heritage. But because of the economic changes in society, that cultural heritage was disappearing. And again, this was a project whereby, can you introduce design into that context to kind of find some way to create a continuity of what's been. And other things came out of that relationship with that university. There's a design centre, which is like a cross between Design Council and V&A, and they asked me to give speeches there. I was invited to oversee an international design competition and so on. And Namphon's outcomes are in terms of sort of dress forms and interior textiles and so on. Different students, I think, interpret their culture traditionally. I think in the UK, if you go into a design course and people are looking for inspiration, they don't say, oh, I'm going to do British culture in my designs. But very often in Asia, you go there and they'll do their own national culture. They're very proud of their culture. Coraclod addressed it in a different way. His interest was the fact that the Thai fashion industry was having to compete with the fashion industry in Vietnam. It was having a tough time. So it was about, well, could you create a distinctive local regional style of fashion? A bit like French fashion, for example, or Italian fashion. We understand the relationship between nationality and design culture. So he looked back for his inspiration to a particular time when Thai aristocrats would peculiarly mix traditional Thai dress with Victorian dress. And he was lucky enough to get sponsorship from Harper's Bazaar, Jim Thompson, which is a famous silk company there, and he premiered a collection of works, about 30 works, at Bangkok Fashion Week. So these are some of those outcomes of designs which seek to fuse an indigenous culture with another, if you like, traditional culture. And there he is. And you can see he's shorter than your average model. And he's now head of fashion at a place called SWU. You reach this point where people start to think, who can we ask to go? And I think often if you're thinking about you might enjoy international work, you have to move yourself into that position where you get on that short list. Will they think of me? Can they see there's some use in sending me to something? And I think after a period of time, my institute, various people in my institution would have me on their list of who can we send, who can travel on their own, who can we trust to do the job. So I started to go further and further afield, and my trips started to become longer and longer, and I would go to different countries. And then at one point, somebody said, who was involved in international recruitment, said, would you like to do China? And I said, well, yeah, I've never been to China. My view of China at that time was, based on every picture I'd seen, I'd expected a world full of people on bicycles. When I got there, I found the most capitalist society I'd ever experienced anywhere. It was relentless business, relentless consumerism, relentless building. If you imagine what New York and America must have been like at the beginning of the 20th century, China is going through its version of that in the past 10 to 15 years. So for a variety of reasons, I went to many different cities across China, sometimes for recruitment, sometimes for that mixed with diplomatic work or conferences, and sometimes for personal relationships that one developed. So what I'm talking about is the furthest north I've been is up here, Changchun, and then there'd be a typical route for recruitment, say, which is Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, and then over in the centre, Chengdu and Xi'an. It's easy to look at on a map. It's kind of the size of Europe, and if you go at a particular time of year, up here it's snowing, up here it's kind of rainy autumnal feel, down here it's hot and sweaty. So you've only got 20 kilos and you have to take kind of 3 outfits for totally different climatic conditions. And I think that's one of the challenges that you have to deal with, that shock. And China is really, if you think of Europe, that these big countries are like many countries within one country. It has all those kind of phenomena of large countries, which is amazing landscapes. It has profound religious traditions. It has the most ancient set of cultures in the world, with kind of artifacts all over the place. It has not just one, but many, many types of cuisine which are quite distinctive and quite outstanding. And the other thing about it is, many places you go, there are just thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. You simply cannot imagine a huge throngs of humanities that you come across. You know, you want to go on a riverboat cruise, suddenly there's 100,000 people trying to get on 3 boats. It's like that. So different countries had different challenges that time. You'd kind of think that, well, it was all just an endless tourist trip. But actually you're doing things like, you have to give talks over and over and over again. You have to be able to work with people who will translate what you say and sensitive about what can be communicated. You have to go on stands for a whole day talking to people, answering their questions about courses, and being polite and being civil and smiling all the time. You have to walk around dead ends of towns and cities where you have no idea where the hell you are or how you're going to get from here to there, and find offices in huge, enormous blocks inside shopping malls. You kind of try and match ways to sort of win people over. So perhaps you try and be cute, or perhaps you try and be polite, or you try and be serious, or whatever kind of fits the situation that you're in. You can work from early morning till late night because the work culture is different. Because people are used to working weekends. They'll work without weekends. They'll work till 9, 10, 11 o'clock in the evening. And then you'll get up early the next morning. You'll meet bunches of strangers, and you have to kind of make it work in the space of a day. I was asked to turn up at 8:30 just to turn up for what I thought was a small meeting, and they just ushered me into a hall with sort of 200-300 people. Can you give a talk, please? Always have your USB and your talk with you. So I have kind of a bag of talks and speeches to give. And other problems like, what the hell should I wear to go there? Have I got it right? And as my partner pointed out, I look like an off-duty policeman. It was not the best choice for that visit. My artistic response is, I guess, you see what's there, you adapt to it, you find your own interpretations of it, whatever it might be. I suppose I'd reached a point where in this sort of 20-year span, and I don't do it so much now, but there's one particular high point where I was going on trips that would last sort of up to 6 weeks. I was spending 3 months of every year travelling around Asia for the best part of a decade, and then life changes a bit, and then I became a head of a big department, and then I didn't like my boss. So I thought, you can stuff your head of department job, I'm going back to be something else. What shall I do now? And because I'd had experience of computers, I'd had experience of art design, I'd run a graphic design course, I'd written about textiles, I'd done so. Because you do whatever comes your way, it seemed to me there was a possibility to start a publishing company. And because I had international connections, it seemed sensible that that was an international publishing company. And I was that dumb to believe I could actually do that easily. Whereas actually, of course, it turns out to be incredibly complicated. Because you have to set up a UK company, you have to set up multiple language interpretations. If you want to work with American companies, you have to set up an American legal entity. And then and that's just the beginning, before you even start to find people who might produce books for you that you can distribute and publish. But anyway, we did, and we found a variety of authors for things like children's books, international partners, started different categories like fiction and design, and so on and so forth. Then another opportunity came up. Suddenly they were reorganising, the bad boss had gone, there was a school of fashion and textiles being formed as an independent entity, and I thought, there are things I would like to do there. And I think life is always about what does my intuition or my heart feel about doing at a particular time. So this got parked. It's like having a car in the street, you know, it's a useful company, it's there, it's not particularly running at the moment. And I shifted my head more recently, the last 2 years, to being a boss again. And I think you reach a point where you think, well, I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot from my international experiences. They've made me who I am, and they're profound. And I want everybody else to have those experiences. I want my students to have those experiences, and I want my staff to have those experiences. So that comes out as a kind of agenda of, well, what can we do? One is about having staff go abroad and having staff come to our institution. Another is about students going abroad and coming to our institution. It's about finding structural relationships between parts of your business. For universities, that's about courses. It's about creating events or opportunities that give people a reason to come and to go or to work together. And it's about sort of people who want to develop their careers in some way in relation to the idea of what global opportunities afford. So I'll end with 2 examples of that. On my sort of relentless travels, I'd visited one institution 2 times. Every time I went, the boss of that institution, or the guy that I dealt with, who was this Professor Wang here, he said, we have this fashion show we take part in. Can you not join with us in some way? So when I took over as boss again, I thought, I'll try and make this happen. Can I get people to give us some money to do this? So fortunately for me, I kind of got the money together, and we had this crazy trip with 4 students to China, and all the usual features of that international experience, which is being shown around endless boring rooms of facilities. You know, here's another workshop, here's another room full of sewing machines, here's whatever it might be. Chinese banquets, ordinary day food, and then we get to this fashion show, which turns out to be something called Jiangnan International Fashion Week, which is actually much bigger than I thought it was going to be. So here's our student groups. So this is the event, there's the kind of final show and so on. And you build in other experiences. Can they see factories? This area, Changshu, is just west of Shanghai. I forget how many garments they produce. It's something like 400 million a week. I mean, it's enormous. You cannot imagine how much stuff is manufactured there. And that's why I was interested in working with these people, because it's a kind of political association. So anyway, this is some other pictures from that week, some kind of designers and their collections. And this guy's an enormous Chinese movie star. And I saw him almost ripped apart, limb by limb, by the audience, by his presence. And this was a styling school who had a catwalk show there. And you start to see how Asian cultures, when they address fashion design, start to use their own cultural references to develop kind of innovative interpretations of what it is. You may also remember that I spoke about Thailand and Namphon and Dao and the people that I've known for years. So another project was the European Union. The European Union has so much money to get rid of, it doesn't know what to do with it. And if you have a big corporation, they trust you with the money. So I applied for something called Erasmus Plus and thought I'll send staff to these institutions that I know in Thailand. So 4 staff got to go over and run workshops in 2 or 3 universities in Thailand. And in turn, those people that I've known for 20 years, who started off, one as my MA student, one as my PhD student, the other became a PhD student of mine again, came back and taught shibori printing to BA textile design students. So what you can see is that what you look for is virtuous kind of circles, that interactions you have with people be open to the possibility that you might get something out of it. Don't go purely into things with an idea of a short-term return. Just go into them with a good spirit and a good heart, because things come back to you. And that attitude of collaboration and cooperation, for me, has been at the heart of my international experience. If you go in there cynical, if you go in there just to make money, if you go in just for personal greed or motivation, it never works. If you go in with a good heart, with a desire for positive outcomes for everybody, then as you can see on the basis of this, stuff happens year on year. It doesn't just happen once. Your aim is to create solid, long-lasting relationships. So I hope that's given you some idea. I put this talk especially just for you. So you're the first people to receive this, which I don't normally talk about 2 decades of travelling. I hope it's given you an idea that this might be something, some point in your lives, it may become an opportunity for you, and this is how you work it. So thank you very much.